Marika Mikiashvili is the foreign secretary of the political party Droa, which is part of Georgia's largest democratic alliance, Coalition for Change. Within Georgian democratic forces, she plays a leading role in fostering international connections and building global support. She is a lecturer at Alte University in Tbilisi and a PhD student at Tbilisi State University. She holds master's degree from the University of St. Andrews. Her expertise covers democratic transition, governance, identity, and security in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Marika is one of the key Georgian voices on X and is experienced in foreign media communication about Georgia.
Welcome to the Lighthouse podcast. Marika Mikiashvili, Foreign Secretary of the Georgian Opposition Party Droa, Coalition for Change. Georgia and Serbia are protesting for more than a year now. And recently, Marika, you were a speaker at the Belgrade Security Conference. So you got acquainted with the situation in Serbia. So in a way, today we can talk about the similarities and differences between the two authoritarian regimes. And in November 2025, ahead of the Belgrade Security Conference, BCSP published scenarios for the exit from the political crisis in Serbia. There are 4 scenarios in total, and one of them, the third scenario, the scenario of hard repression, we call it internally the Georgian scenario. So where can Serbia of today go into in the future, looking ahead towards mid 2026, end of 2026. So this is what I want to talk to you about today. How did Georgia slide into the authoritarianism of today? And knowing that there are many similarities between the two countries, coincidentally, the two regimes came to power with the election victories in 2012. So both the Georgian Dream and the Serbian Progressive Party here. So what we experienced, I think in both cases, is this gradual state capture. So I want to ask you maybe first, Marika, I guess this did not happen overnight. So how did the Georgian Dream get hold of the institutions?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Cvijić, for invitation. It's my pleasure to share Georgia's experience with you, although I hope that Serbia will not go down the Georgian scenario, and I hope that Georgia itself will not go down the Belarusian scenario, as we call it in Georgia. So the Georgian Dream came to power in 2012, yes, through elections. It was the only instance in the recent history of Georgia when power was changed in peaceful means through elections. And it was, of course, hailed as democracy and so on. The Georgian Dream Party was founded by a Russian-made Georgian oligarch, Bidzina Ivanishvili. But some people have misconception that Georgians actively chose a pro-Russian party. That was not the case. It's in Georgia. This anti-Kremlin stance and also pro-European Union stance is very strong. So Ivanishvili, he promised European integration without triggering Russia. He promised to have good relations with everyone and to ameliorate a human rights record, because a major problem with the previous government, the United National Movement, was human rights record. And Ivanishvili had his wealth compared to Georgia's national GDP was 35% back when he came to power. So some countries have many oligarchs, like Ukraine, for example, but Georgia had just one. It still has just one, but his wealth is just immense. Georgia used to have a mixed member parliamentary representation, which means that half was elected through proportional list, half was elected through single constituencies like majoritarian states. And this created a huge disproportion in power. For example, in 2016, when it was already a second term for the Georgian Dream, they received 48% of national votes, but the entire parliament. They could single-handedly amend the constitution. So this mixed member parliament was one big problem. Another is a hyper-centralized state. In Georgia, municipalities do not have any autonomy whatsoever. They don't even have a financial income of their own. Municipalities completely depend on central government. So that was the second problem. Third problem, as I said, it was Ivanishvili's personal wealth. So the combination of the three, the entire parliament, which then made up the entire government, and then the hyper-centralized state. So whoever is in parliament and government, they appoint every level of official in the country, from the lowest ranking representatives in some village administration, something, and the disproportionate wealth of Ivanishvili. So conditions were absolutely ripe for him to take over. And again, unfortunately, the judiciary and the police and state administration, even before, used to be made up of system loyalists. And what happened was that since power changed, many loyalists simply, as we call it, teleported to become Georgian Dream supporters. And Georgian Dream, their narrative was that they were fighting the United National Movement. Even to this day, their biggest demon, the factor that they demonize, is the United National Movement. Everything that happens in Georgia more than
10 years after.
More than 10 years. For example, in December 2025, a school roof fell off in one smaller town in Georgia, Khashuri, and they said that it was the United National Movement government's fault of 13 years ago.
That sounds very 14. Familiar.
Yes. So, but they were very happy to integrate the system of the UNM, the judiciary, and everything. So people who actually made the UNM rule unpopular, people who were actually responsible for quite poor human rights record of the previous era, they are all Georgian Dream. And they all got promoted by the Georgian Dream, and the Georgian Dream is happy to use them for their dirty stuff and decisions. So actually by the end of 2025, it crystallized that they're simply against the good that the United National Movement did. And they were very happy to integrate the structures and use it for their own benefit. And the takeover happened gradually, of course. The first 8 years, it was a little less seen, a little less, a little less overt. It happened more covertly, but it was there.
And in the media sphere, because usually you mentioned Hungary and we are in Serbia, one of the important levers of authoritarian power was to get hold of the media sphere. How did this develop from 2012 onward?
The media sphere also deteriorated, started deterioration at around 2019. I would say that initially it was okay. So the entire thing with the Georgian Dream is that they are a Trojan horse operation. So they would not do something too soon, too fast, and too openly. Their modus operandi, their entire essence is that they kind of anesthetized the society. The society was put under anesthesia the first 7-8 years. they made people believe that it was going more or less okay, while their pace was a little slow. And precisely by the time they had slowly captured everything, after 2020 and especially after 22, that they made their face shown. In 2019, the first major case with the media was they targeted the largest critical media, then Rustavi Ori, Rustavi 2, that's how it translates. And they began prosecution against its director, Nika Guaramia, who was prosecuted on some very trumped up charges about misuse of the company's car or something like that. The entire period of 2010s, the Georgian Dream benefited from strategic disengagement of the West from the region. So they said that they would bring Georgia to European Union and also NATO, although NATO toned down. They were more focusing on European Union while having good relations with Russia. But the strategic ambiguity of the 2010s allowed that. Once Russia invaded Ukraine full scale in 2022, the Georgian Dream couldn't sit on two chairs, as we say in Georgia, and they increasingly had to choose sides. And that is when they began choosing Russia more and more, so that people saw it more and more.
But
and
even,
from
even
2020...
even before, I wanted to bring you back, maybe because we mentioned this, 2019, you had these Gavrilov night protests, and where I think maybe I'm mistaken, but it's the first time that you saw this heightened police repression in response to the demonstration. So maybe before you go on to 2022, you can tell us something about that, because that's the first time that rubber bullets were used on the
Yes.
crowd, right?
So on June 20, 2019, a Russian State Duma member from a communist party who was presiding over Interparliamentary Assembly of Orthodoxy. So he's an Orthodox believer but communist. He presided over the actual chair of Georgia's Speaker of the Parliament, who was Irakli Kobakhidze, who is now the so-called Prime Minister. And it was devastating visuals for the people of Georgia, because Russia occupies 20% of Georgia. We have a very difficult relationship and colonial legacy by Russia. So seeing a Russian Duma member in the chair of the Speaker of the Parliament of Georgia was not something people wanted to see, and immediately protests followed. To the point that I was an intern right behind the Parliament building. There was a very nice foundation, Rondel Foundation. I rushed there, one of the first, maybe I was even the first who went there, and I saw people coming, people whom I knew, like my acquaintances, friends. They were coming in gym clothes and, like completely unequipped to protest. They dropped everything they were at and rushed to protest with the metros, taxis. So you could see that it was extremely spontaneous and people simply dropped everything to come and protest. I actually remember some coming with like gym clothing. And yes, the demands of the people were for the Speaker of the Parliament, Kobakhidze, to resign. But in the evening, there were clashes, rubber bullets followed. Several people lost their eyes due to rubber bullets. And the government, back then they were the government. Now we call them regime because they're an illegitimate, they're autocratic regime. Back then, the government maintained that protesters tried to storm the parliament building and the force used was proportionate and everything was right. However, In December 2025, the European Court of Human Rights issued their decision that none of it was right and that the state violated even prohibition of torture in some cases. And now the Georgian Dream brushes it off to then Minister of Internal Affairs, who is now in opposition. Anyway, so this triggered the first major crisis, and actually every crisis that came after that stems from the Gavrilov's night, as we call it.
So in October 2020, there are these parliamentary elections, and the opposition calls out fraud and steps out, doesn't take part in the second round of the mixed part of the elections, right? So of the single constituencies, which ODIHR also in their report, OSCE ODIHR cites numerous irregularities related to these elections. Maybe because I think elections of 2024 were probably worse. So we can talk about the electoral irregularities later, but here I wanted to ask you more. Then EU steps in as sort of a mediator, right? And we have these Charles Michel agreements. So can you tell us, who was then the president of the European Council? So can you tell us a bit more about this environment? COVID elections, fraud, the opposition steps out. What happens with this EU mediation, and what does the Georgian Dream do? How do they position themselves there?
Yes, there were elections during COVID, and it was a little tricky because people were hopeful that all the big lines at the polling stations meant that there was change coming, because the turnout is high, but turned out that it was just COVID restriction measurements that the lines appeared bigger than they were because of the distance that people were taking in between. In Georgia we have this, unfortunately, what we call like standard normal rigging. It's quite telling that we would call it like standard rigging, because that means that it has been applied forever. And it implies heavy manipulation and carrots and sticks. The state has near totalitarian knowledge on everyone in the country. It's a small country of 3.7 million, and the security structures are quite well equipped and strong. They know everyone's problems. They know whose father is in jail. They know whose mother needs cancer treatment, whether you had your driver's license revoked and you needed to be restored. So they have something on everyone, and they either threaten people that their family member's sentence will be prolonged in prison if they don't vote for the Georgian Dream, or the opposite, they will pardon their family member or fund their family member's cancer treatment if they vote for the Georgian Dream. And they've been ensuring that quite successfully. And then there were large-scale reports that people were forced to take pictures of their votes. We had paper-based voting back then, so you had to just circle the candidate, and people had to send the proof to Georgian Dream party offices, local party offices. It got to the point when they even instructed people to cross out every other candidate to ensure that the person wouldn't change their option after they sent the picture to the Georgian Dream party office. That was the thing. The manipulation and carrots and sticks was the main drive behind heavy manipulation and rigging in 2020. Then the opposition considered these elections rigged, I would say rightfully, because the outcome was quite manipulated. And the boycott lasted several months. Then the then president of European Council, Charles Michel, arrived to broker an agreement. So apparently he was looking for a crisis to solve. After intense negotiations, and I remember we were all looking at TV to the point that the TV stations even flew drones near the windows of the negotiations to have a look at what was happening inside, because everyone had very high hopes for these negotiations. I mean, the general population. And we remember all the big pizza boxes being arrived from like deliveries at these negotiation rooms overnight. So there were some conditions, quite vague conditions. It was about ameliorating some judicial postulates, but eventually the Georgian Dream withdrew from the agreement after the opposition already entered the parliament, and the Georgian Dream was no longer a one-party parliament. After they got what they wanted, the legitimacy, the good visuals, they then withdrew from the Charles Michel agreement.
So
They blame it on opposition.
This example of backtracking, and then
Exactly. They just won what they wanted at that moment, and after that, nothing really mattered. We see that this was a big strategic mistake, actually, from the opposition, because the Georgian Dream completely crystallized, consolidated itself internally, institutionally, precisely during that term. After 2021 and until 2024, they dedicated all resources to strengthening the security apparatus and all of that. And they used opposition's presence in the parliament as legitimacy, both domestic and external. And in the meantime, the number of opposition initiatives that passed as a law in parliament was zero. Absolutely zero. So some people, especially foreigners, they usually say that the opposition should be using the parliament to engage and to make the best of the situation. But what happens when the regime, government, completely disregards your existence? They will ignore everything you say just because you're opposition, and in the meantime, they will use your existence to do their dirty business. So that is what happened in Georgia.
I will ask you about that, because that also sounds very familiar. And I will ask you about the role of the, foreigners, the EU, but later I will now ask you about some other foreigners in the Georgian context, because you already started talking about the post second wave of the Russian aggression in Ukraine pivot in the Georgian local political context. This is very interesting from the Serbian perspective, because as you said, Russia holds 20% of Georgian territory occupied, and the occupation was long-standing, but the actual Russian troops came in 2008. And how did the Georgian Dream manage? We understand the geopolitical, the economic dependence, but how did they manage to make this pivot in the narrative, in the local political narrative, to make it friendly towards Russia?
Well, actually, the Georgian Dream never said that Russia is a good or a friend or something like that. They create the informational space where Russia is simply presented indirectly as a lesser evil, because they, especially in the last few years, they try to demonize the collective West as, so one big part of propaganda is that the West drags Georgia into war with Russia. The entire survival of the Georgian Dream, I would say, depended on the success of this narrative in the last few years after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They used all their propaganda resources and all their money supporting these resources to convince not a majority but a sufficient minority of population that if opposition comes to power, there will be war with Russia. And they're the only guarantors of peace, because Europe demanded the opening of the second front to weaken Russia, which is completely absurd, because Georgia, especially in current military conditions, like, would probably fall to Russia within a day or two. So there's absolutely no rationale for anyone to want any war in Georgia, because it won't even serve as Russia's distraction. It will be such a quick victory for Russia in that sense. That's the thing. And they also say that the West makes Georgia gay. They impose LGBT laws. And they contrast this with the traditional family values and the orthodoxy, everything that Russia propagates, that they represent. So this is how Georgian Dream tries to operate.
The Georgian Dream is not saying Russia is good. They're saying the West is bad, but they increasingly, since 2024, start adopting Russian instruments of rule. And I want to ask you about the foreign agents law, because in March 2023 they proposed the first foreign agents law to be adopted. Coincidentally, in Serbia, the government majority, one party from the coalition, completely under the control of the president, proposed that in August 2023, so just a couple of months later. And in Georgia, the Georgian Dream withdrew the bill then. In Serbia, they also withdrew the bill, and unlike in Georgia, in Serbia, it didn't come back to to be considered for adoption. In Georgia, it was adopted in 2024. So why did they withdraw it first? Why did they adopt it? Maybe you talked something about it when backing down and coming in full force, but it's very interesting. And also, what did this law do to the Georgian civil society and to the democratic front in general in the country?
The foreign agents law, it is problematic from the very beginning. Not least so because the word agent in Georgian means a spy. So what they're saying is that whoever receives Western money is a spy. So this foreign agents law rang a few bells for Georgians. One is that it really recalled the Soviet memory of people being labeled as agents and then imprisoned or shot. And then we also knew how it went in Russia, that this was one of the first laws that later led to autocracy in Russia. I remember it was a few days before the parliament was supposed to discuss this foreign agents law in 2023. It was, I think, end of February or early March. And we had this big meeting, opposition party, civil society, activists. We had this big meeting in one big room. And we were just assessing, projecting, like, what could happen. Like, will the people come out? Will the people protest? No one could imagine the scales of crowds at the protest and just how effective this No to Russian Law campaign was. We called it Russian Law. And the Russian law dubbing and campaign was so effective that I think some GD person even joked recently that even he sometimes accidentally calls the law Russian law, because it's so ingrained in the mainstream speech by now. It was completely a shock, the scale of protests and the clashes. There were 2 consecutive nights of clashes. Again, the Georgian Dream, of course, like in a completely unprovoked manner, began a crackdown. This time they try to avoid rubber bullets, and to this day they do. They opt for suffocating people through
gases.
Yeah, and
I will ask you about that.
Yeah, okay, I'll get to that later. And the Georgian Dream backtracked. Again, this was a tactical backtracking to come back stronger later. And now we see very clearly that from March 2023 to April 2024, when they again tabled this Russian law, foreign agents law, and pushed through, for this year, what they did was invest immensely in security apparatus. So, if they had not backtracked in 2023, if the clashes continued, it was already spiraling out of their control. And in 2023, public demand was no to Russian law. Their main focus was against this particular law. It was not yet against the government in general. And by the way, with the Gavrilov's night, that was the thing as well. Unfortunately, back then, Gavrilov's night was in average Georgian understanding, was perceived as an exception, as something extraordinary, not a common pattern of the Georgian Dream rule. So unfortunately, until recently, when the big picture started forming for Georgians in 2023, 4 and 5, all of this was mistakes or like not part of big picture. And so people focused against this one law. And I remember that I had the sense on the second day of the crackdowns that if this continues even one more day, this is already starting to become against government protests and not just against law. If I sensed it, the Georgian Dream also sensed it, and that is why they backtracked and made people go home. Because they did not have the security apparatus capacity to deal with continued protests and crackdowns.
Then you had another parliamentary elections, and I guess there you can no longer talk about standard rigging, as you said. So can you tell us a bit about these elections, because this is what, and then the Georgian Dream withdrawal, from or freeze of the EU accession, how you would frame it, caused this enormous protests that are lasting to this day. So how were these elections in comparison to the 2020? Because by then, the apparatus was consolidated. They got, whom they wanted in which place. They got ready for it, as you said. So tell us something about these elections.
Yes, the usual manipulation was present, of course, and even more rigorous. What was different in 2024 elections was mass rigging on election day proper. So before the fate of elections used to be sealed before election day, and now it was not sufficient for them. So for the first time, Georgia had electronically assisted voting, which means that registration and vote counting happened through machines. The ballot was a paper, but still. So what they did was that they orchestrated a very elaborate scheme of multiple voting using ID cards of Georgians abroad. Up to 700,000 Georgians of voting age are abroad, and there were only around 60 voting polling stations abroad. So most people aren't even registered and physically cannot come. That was a big issue. They excluded immigrants from voting. But most Georgians aren't registered as voters abroad either. They took their ID cards and voted on their behalf.
Where does the majority of Georgians live abroad? In which countries?
There are lots of them in Italy, Greece, United States, Poland, France.
Russia? How did they get their ID cards?
The state controls everything. They have the Ministry of Internal Affairs. They have a judiciary, they have Central Election Commission, so they just printed however many ID cards of different people they needed. There's this election studies that they see patterns of abnormal voting the diagrams and all of that. And Roman Udot, Russian election scientist, he also contributed a lot in this study. He had it on Twitter. So they calculated that 300,000 votes, or 14 to 15% of votes, were rigged on election day. So 15% of votes were abnormal votes. And that is actually precisely coinciding with the discrepancy between official results and exit poll results. And the 14% discrepancy is precisely the difference with the official result of 54% that the Central Election Commission gave them. And you can imagine that according to Central Election Commission, the Georgian Dream, after all these Russian law protests and the 12 years in government, they're more popular than when they were elected in 2012.
Right.
They have more
votes. Tells us another thing, that about the elections, because it basically tells us that these types of regimes will steal as much as they need to be in power.
Yes, you're very right to say that these regimes, and I can vouch for the Georgian Dream, they will get exactly the amount of votes that they need. There's this false perception among some people that, if we had only tried harder, if we had only gathered more votes, we would outvote them. That is precisely not true. They again had the totalitarian knowledge on all voters in the country. They knew how many percent they needed to win. And nothing prevented them from printing another 50,000 ID cards. So there's no winning against the Georgian Dream through elections. It is impossible. Yes, of course, we demand free and fair elections, but not out of the mercy of the regime. But we want to break the regime, disorientate them, and have the sense of victory before the election day. But of course, we want formally to transfer power peacefully through elections. But it should be a formality. The Georgian Dream's entire system, like state security and judiciary and the clans and business, everything should be overpowered and won over before election day. And election day will simply be the formalization of the transfer. Our ideal vision, ideal scenario is that we have a big tent resistance movement and platform. It's not just parties. It should be political parties plus civil society plus regime prisoner families, because they are extremely unyielding and principled, and they're great fighters. And by the way, now Georgia has more political prisoners per capita than Russia, and plus students and activists. Since the Georgian Dream voters are not really ideological voters, but many of them are comfort zone voters and going with the inertia of power, if they see power projected from elsewhere, if they see a gravitation center in this common platform of democratic resistance, a lot of Georgian Dream people can be, it's possible to swing a lot of them. And in terms of autocratic laws, it is absolutely insane. Currently, any unauthorized protest, even on the pavement, is penalized. If you stand on a pavement without prior notice 5 days before to authorities, you risk 15 days jail on the first offense and up to 1 year criminal imprisonment for the second time offense. And we already have the first case of administrative detention over standing on a pavement.
You have all sorts of lawfare, Russian-style lawfare going on. You have your own party colleagues and other opposition parties who are sentenced to multiple years in jail. Can you tell us for what? How many people?
Yes, definitely. So currently, almost all opposition leaders in Georgia are in jail.
Because many people saw the BBC documentary When Water Burns, and so basically, they saw scenes that were not in the Flanders fields at the beginning of the 20th century, but in Georgia, EU candidate country in the 21st century, where brombenzyl cyanide, the First World War weapon, a chemical weapon, was used on the demonstrators. So, what was the reason? Why did they use it? Is this sort of a chilling effect that we talk about a lot, that authoritarian regimes apply to, let's say, make sure that people don't come out of the street?
Yes, so the BBC documentary found evidence of bromobenzyl cyanide, or chemate, the World War I era chemical substance. It, of course, needs international investigation, and we request international investigation into the case. My party and Coalition for Change, we addressed 9 international institutions, UN, Council of Europe, OSCE, different structures to have this international investigation into possible chemical weapons usage against peaceful protesters in Georgia, whether it is chemate or something else. The Georgian Dream's later reactions, they were completely paralyzed for a couple of days. So it destabilized their propaganda narrative, and there have only been a couple of instances when their propaganda has been destabilized in all of their rule. So inconsistency in their behavior and statements is one alarming issue. Contradictory statements, lack of transparency about everything they say and they supposedly investigate, and persecution of journalists and witnesses. So they started 2 investigations after BBC reportage. One was possible excessive power, misuse of power by officials, and the second was aiding a foreign organization with hostile activities, harming Georgia's national interests, and so on.
Which foreign organization would that be? BBC?
Probably BBC, probably, right. But not only. The first investigation they closed, and they said nothing wrong, absolutely, it was just normal gas. But they're proceeding with this second investigation. So they interrogated people who gave interviews to BBC. They interrogated even those people who spoke up on Facebook about their lasting symptoms after that. And yeah, I would not be surprised if they jail people over giving interviews to BBC, or the doctors who did a study on it that the BBC later used. There was brutal torture of people, especially in police minivans in the late November, early December 2024. Then the Georgian Dream, again, they sensed that it was getting out of control, and what they did was they stopped crackdowns, and for some time they let the protests be, and they were hoping at some different milestones that the protests would just stop and go home. At the New Year's, because the celebration and New Year's in Georgia is a dead season. You won't find a person doing any job over the New Year's. Everybody's, so it's a huge national celebration. Everybody's, as we say, their head is in the food. That's how we say over the New Year. They hope that New Year's would win protests. Then they hope that Trump would come in the US and officially back the Georgian Dream. And then the protests would stop. Then they hope that Easter season, then summer would stop the protests. The protests never stop. So that's the thing. The Georgia is at the painful stalemate. So The protesters aren't going home. The Georgian Dream cannot fully eradicate it. This is just like a big stalemate.
So thank you once again, Marika Mikiashvili. It was a really fascinating conversation, and I'm absolutely certain that people here will take it almost as a direct allegory to what's going on in Serbia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's my pleasure.